What's going on, everybody? Today is September 12th. It's Tuesday, and you're listening and watching to the Daily AI Show live. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Today, we are getting to talk about open source. So we want to talk about, first we're going to kick off with like what is open source, but we're also going to talk about how that ends up democratizing AI to the masses and what that could potentially mean for countries and individuals who typically not have access to it. Talk about challenging the giants. I think it'd be cool to talk at some point about, Google's famously leaked memo of "we have no moat," which I think is really, really amazing. And what does that mean for the giants of industry and tech right now? And then, if we have time, we can also talk about some of those, ethical and legal implications of open source and what that means using the business. So lots to talk about, lot to go over in the next 30 minutes as always. So I would love to just start off with a starting point. If somebody wants to jump in with, how would you guys define open source to you?
I've always thought of it as software that is quote unquote free. And it's usually developed by groups of people and they don't put copyright on it. That's been my version of it. And the most common open source product I know is WordPress, which I've been using for 10 or 20 years. So yeah, that's what I think of it.
I agree essentially. So open source software is I hate to use this word, but a movement. Basically an idea that generates collaboration amongst everybody, anywhere in the world. They want more software out there. They want to solve lots of problems, and they want to have the freedom to work on those software projects, right? Without having to worry about IP rights and copyright and those kinds of things. So they've set up, so it's a structure that's been set up so that people can freely develop and program and build open source software, and then distribute as they will. One of the big rules is if you use open source software for development, that goes into the larger pool of open source software. So any development you do for it has to be released to the larger good of the people, so to speak.
So you got to give back basically to the system, right? If you take from it, you got to give back to it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think the other element is that the code is available for people to access. So if you look at open source versus, let's use a classic example, Microsoft Office or Microsoft Windows. You don't get the source code that you can go in and make your own changes to. You just get what they give you, and whether they charge you or not, it's neither here nor there. Whereas, as I understand open source, you get the source code. You can go in and make your own changes and all sorts of stuff.
It depends. Yeah. There's layers.
Yeah, and there's probably exceptions to that rule.
So here's a good time to first off, my first introduction to open source was Linux. Like that was like, what's this Linux stuff? And that was the first I ever heard that term was the Linux operating system, which is open source, which is a very different, as Jimmy was referring, it's a movement, it's a different ethos, a different thought process that we're better as a mass, as better in a group mentality than we are holding on to this tech and having our 10 programmers do it. It's better to put it out to the community. And there's a lot of truth behind that. But when you mentioned that open source is open, what's ironically the llama was not that recently Facebook and where Meta had released or got released. It wasn't actually open. It wasn't like their traditional.
That was accidental open source.
I was going to say it was leaked first, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it didn't have all the weights though. So you actually couldn't do as much as everybody thought you could do with that particular model. But that aside, the beauty of having open source going into it, another thought process I was having, if you go to Hugging Face, which is the repository of a lot of these open source models, and you'll see, the nomenclature, the naming of each one of these models is basically, could be llama / bearded dragon or whatever, and they're gonna modify the model with whatever intent that they're wanting to do with it. It could be that they're retraining or fine tuning it on medical documents or something. So it's really fun to watch people run with it, because these people are in their basements, and they're good at programming, they're good at working things together. And what's funny is Meta is watching this, and so they get to benefit from all these brilliant people for free. It's kind of a great business model.
Yeah, we're just looking into the Llama 2 because I was trying to think Llama also, Llama 2, Llama also. But what I was going to say is, because I was curious of it, I was trying to think of the timeline on it. And what I'm seeing is that they released it. Then in March of 23, a torrent containing the model's weights was uploaded to 4chan. And then that blew up. And then later Meta and Microsoft, which I forgot Microsoft was involved with it, introduced Llama 2, the next generation of open source, and the large language model, and it's free for research and commercial use. So yeah, interesting whether it happened to Meta, and then they said, we really, really want to push open source, or whether they would have done that. Because I don't think traditionally we think of Meta, aka Facebook, as being this, giving of open source material. We've seen Elon Musk do this several times, so it's not really shocking when he releases things as open source. He's done that many times before with like the Hyperloop, right? He made that open source. As far as now, I don't know if that was code per se, but the idea that anybody could go and create and make more from the Hyperloop. And I think this brings up this good point. Like I was mentioning, there was a famous memo that got leaked from Google, it was an internal memo, and it basically said, we have no moat. And what I read was that within months of this open source coming out of like Llama 2 and stuff like that, that the open source community had achieved 97% efficiency or similarity to OpenAI within months. And so like that's like that mind-blowing stat, 97% within months. And is that just because you've literally got so many hands in the basket that everybody is able to make quick changes? And then does that also protect against malicious bugs and stuff? Because you also, for every bad actor, you might still have 10 good actors who are coming over the top to fix that and clean it up. A la, Wikipedia. Like, why is Wikipedia not just awful and wrong all the time? Well, because there's a lot of hands making sure that Wikipedia also stays right and correct. So I'll throw that back to you guys, because I'm not the expert here, so I'm curious.
Well, I found a post on opensource.org, so that's supposedly the voice of open source. And they say, July 20th, OSI is pleased to see that Meta is lowering barriers for access to powerful AI systems. Unfortunately, the tech giant has created the misunderstanding that Llama 2 is open source. It is not. So, and you can go on from there. So it's whatever they choose to call it. He said Meta is confusing open source with resources available to some users under some conditions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah,
that's mainly because they didn't release it under an open source license. So I mean, they like you said, the article basically said, "Oh, we'll release it to commercial use and research use." That's not the same thing as an open source license, right?
Yeah.
So
We've already talked about
the
main things that an open source license covers. What's that?
I was just really.
I want to point out an idea that's related to open sourcing. Something is that you can get the code and host it yourself. So typically, when a big code base is made, as Meta did, they're hosting it, but someone leaked the content of that open source, or not open source. They leaked the code base. Now, that made it possible to download that code base and host it on your own servers. That's generally true about open source. Is that I'll give you an example. In e-commerce, Magento, which is formerly an A company and then was sold to Adobe, that is available as open source code. It's also run and available for subscription directly from Adobe, and you can buy a very expensive platform. But if you want to get the code, and it's written in PHP, and you want your team to make modifications to it, customizations, you can download the source code in the community edition, and then run it on your own servers and make changes to it. There isn't any obligation to feed that back to the open source, collective. but it allows you to do something on your own. There's a bunch of open source LLMs, right? The big foundation models. There are a number, I should say the smaller ones are typically open source, or the open source ones are typically smaller. Llama 2 is a really big one that you can get the code base for. And the promise of this, the so what, is if you don't like the transaction costs that you're having to pay to OpenAI or somebody else who's hosting one of these things and making it accessible via an API, eventually you can run one of these things, one of these architectures for chat bots or general reasoning LLMs. You can run those locally on your own machine in a smaller version, or if you have a big enough server architecture, like at AWS or Azure or wherever you want, you can run your own version of the model, hosting it yourself.
So now, Andy, would you say that this is something that, as you see it, okay, what you just said, the so what? So now I'm an executive, I'm listening to this, or maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm just a manager or something. I'm like, I want that. I want what Andy just said. So does it right now, is it sort of limited by the size of the company and the internal resources they would have in order to deploy something like this? Or are you considering that if somebody theoretically was let's just say less than 50 employee company, so small, right? Less than 50 employee company, and they wanted to internally deploy an OpenAI comparison internally on their databases, only supplemented by their own internal databases. They don't want anybody else to have any access to it. Is that possible? Is that relatively easy for a company to do, or anybody, as you guys see?
It is. If you have somebody internally who can do some coding, I'll just reference one of the big players in open source. It's called Llama Index, no relation to Llama the LLM. It was funded with a very large seed round by Greylock, the venture capital firm that has an incredible track record of funding the big players in an industry like LinkedIn, for example. So Greylock, giving this nod of approval to Llama Index, the CEO and founder of that is Jerry Liu. And he's a great person to follow if you want to read about what's going on in open source. Well, Llama Index is an example of that. And you can use Llama Index to create your own system of all the different elements that are necessary to operate a conversational interface on the web to a large language model. So yeah, it is available. What I'm doing personally is I'm just being comforted by the availability of open source, because I'm thinking that brings price pressure down, price pressure on all of the paid models, because it'll bring it down to the cost of actually running your own server operations, and you can do that easily on Amazon Web Services, for example.
Speaking of which, guys, you probably saw I posted an article in our private Slack group earlier. NVIDIA, who's one of the big players in the hardware that processes all of this AI stuff, apparently they've just come up with this software hack that they've literally doubled the performance of their H100 GPUs for free. So as the technology gets better, because it's still expensive to do this stuff at the moment, as the technology gets better, it's going to get cheaper anyway. So very interesting developments, probably worth keeping an eye on.
So it's very easy to fall for the sizzle of open sourcing and doing it on your own server and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, are they commercially licensable? So can you use it for your organization? That's a big question. 2, how is it supported? So it could be made redundant in a week, and now you're building your whole company on an open source model that's not going to be supported, and you're not going to be able to have updates or changes. And if they do update it and change it, now you're struggling. Whereas having an API to an existing supported framework like OpenAI and Claude, maybe those offer a little bit more security and reliability. I mean, I'm sure people on this call would kind of lean in that camp. If you're doing something for a client, you might not want to do it on the open source methodology unless they specifically know the risks and rewards, I guess. Andy, what do you think about that?
I agree that as I was saying, I'm just taking comfort from the open source availability, meaning I believe that will be accessible to me down the line. But right now, I would definitely recommend that you go with somebody who's already gotten a proven implementation, and you're going to pay subscription fees for access to those platforms. But it's going to be much more reliable at this stage than having your own developers or hiring a contract developer to put together an open source Frankenstein to do it. Frankenstein is probably an unfair word, because much of the open source code is advancing rapidly to the degree it's going to be outperforming the paid versions. Why? Because you have a very large community actively contributing developers, all pushing the open source platform forward with advancements, improvements, enhancements. All of those things are going into that and accelerating the competence and the capabilities of those open source systems.
Right. So part of what we're saying is that the open source revolution and culture benefits you whether you actively engage it or not.
Right.
Right. From a business standpoint, yay, all yay. And still, like one of the things that I think about is how much are you taking on that you then, by the nature of how you built it, now need to be paying attention to. And that like power of attention, limited attention is, I think in most situations, I think that's worth it to use another company's, not just development and interface and maybe they're experts, but also that they're responsible now for paying attention to the 8 million things that are changing every day.
And I think I have a good just example of this from my life. So years ago when we had our own nutrition company, I worked with a friend, amazing. We used an open source model called Joomla that we were using in conjunction with WordPress and things like that. But we built it on Joomla. And anyway, I didn't have necessarily, I'm the business owner, right? I didn't have necessarily a background in it. But buddy who's running it, he said, look, you're going to have a lot more flexibility. You're going to have a lot more ability to do the custom things that we're looking to do for nutrition. And we were trying to do some custom things with the website. He said, you want to go with something that's got flexibility like that. Okay, great. But now looking back at it 5 years later, right? And having that vision of being able to hindsight and look backwards, what I would say is that, yes, there was some flexibility, but either I needed to have the cash reserves to pay somebody fully to manage that and take that hat off. Because what I did instead was I learned Joomla as I was going. And when I think about all the wasted hours invested in being wrong and what that did to my business ultimately actually really hurt it. So whatever the benefit was, I actually fought consistently against weird quirks and tweaks and things that had to be done that I would have to go ask or dig into, Reddit communities about to figure out why Joomla was acting that way. I think about it the same way with iPhones in my house. I'm actually more of the Android type person. Truthfully, I'd rather be able to play with it and do all that stuff. Truthfully, but I've had an Apple iPhone now for over 10 years. And the reason for that is simple. Apple iPhone, my wife, my daughter, Apple CarPlay, Apple TV. I don't even have a Mac. I've never owned a Mac in my life. I don't like Macs. I only like PCs or whatever. But I have all these Apple products in my house. And the reason is because at 45 years old, I simply don't want to deal with having 6 or 7 different systems going on in the house at once, because it only comes back on me to have to go fix it when it doesn't work. I don't want to know 7 systems. I want to know one, and I want to know that it's supported with updates all the time. Now, some people are going to say, iPhone, whatever. And I go, yeah, you're right. It's behind. It's usually behind whatever's cool in Android, and that sucks. But it takes care of itself. And as the business owner in the house, right, or the guy that has to be the IT, well, I'm not the business owner. I'm the IT tech guy, whether I want to be or not. And as the tech department, I don't want to deal with it. I just want it to be smooth and easy all the way. So that's the way I think about this. Like, you guys are making really good points of, there's some really cool stuff out there. But if you're a business, be careful. How many hours and what's the real true impact for your business? And is it greater than probably the amount of time that you're going to have to devote internal resources or externally to consultants or whoever to build? And then I think whoever said it, maintain the system. Because, you know, Robert, you were saying it's going to change. It's going to, you know, and do you want to do that yourself with open source? Or do you want to have a little bit of the security of knowing the API is going to be backed or whatever the case may be? So I don't know if that makes sense.
Sorry, Robert. I'd like to put a little pushback on that, Brian. Okay. What you say is true. And that's a great comparison. And as an overall strategy, I agree. Those are things that you have to address. But I will say that in the open source community, there are support organizations, right? Not just having access to information and the latest developments, but organizations that are specifically there that actively develop and maintain a version or code base for whatever open source solution that you're going for. So to me, it's more of an akin of, do you want to pay Google and Microsoft to do the maintenance and ease of use? Or do you want to pay one of these organizations for maintenance and ease of use? It just is.
A la Red Hat.
Yeah, a la Red Hat or other examples. So they exist. So it's just more of a choice. What what platform, what infrastructure or framework you want to go with. But I do agree, some companies do it better. And Apple's a fantastic example of that. It's, here's our little ecosystem. All we do is make it work and and go from there. Not the best, not the greatest, or the most advanced, but we make it work, right?
And
so I agree with you on that. But a little bit of the pushback is there are organizations that can provide that for you.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So, you know, we've been talking about some of these open source systems. I mean, you know, and I was looking them up earlier. Firefox was open source. People don't think about Blender as being open source. You mentioned Linux, Robert. The VLC media player, which a lot of people had on their desktops for a long time or whatever, that's open source. And we talked about WordPress, Joomla. So, you know, we're probably, I think as a society, we're probably actually more familiar and using more open source than perhaps we realize are part of our ecosystem. I mean, just those alone, I'm thinking, yeah, I used Mozilla Firefox is what I was trying to say. I used Firefox all the time before Chrome. That was my in-between between Explorer and Edge or whatever you want to call it now and Microsoft. And then I used Firefox for years and years and years. And then eventually, you know, same sort of thing. Chrome comes out with all the extensions, all the stuff. And you go, well, that would be easier, you know, and you find yourself sort of giving up some of the control in order to have things just be a little bit easier. So it's funny. I think, you know, businesses in general are thinking the same thing. Where do I put my time versus investment? Is this going to be slightly easier on the company? And what do I give up in terms of control? And does that control make a big difference for my value prop? Like maybe that control is a bigger deal. And for their particular unique value prop, they need to go that way. So it's just a really interesting, and to your point, Andy and Beth, regardless, it helps everybody anyway. So it's a good thing overall, which I think is kind of cool.
I've been a GIMP user for years. Until Firefly.
Perhaps you should explain that for the people who don't know what that means.
Sorry. GIMP is
I know it.
GIMP is basically Photoshop, open source Photoshop. And that is why I use them. I used Photoshop for a while, and then I had to pay out of my pocket. So Photoshop was pretty expensive. And all I was doing was some basic stuff. And it literally wasn't until everyone was talking about Firefly, and I really, all right, fine. There's a $20 a month photography license that gives you Photoshop and access to Firefly. And I was like, all right, I'll check this out.
All right. Well, I'd like to bring up the TLDR and ask everyone what's the one thing they see for the future of open source and AI?
Well, I'm not going first today.
Okay, so one of the things that's an option beyond using what's called retrieval augmented generation as a model for creating a conversational AI support is fine-tuning your model. Now, you'll be able to do that on some of the big platforms. You'll be able to train your own instance of a model, but that's going to cost you money. That means that that provider, whether it's Vertex or it's Bedrock at Amazon Web Services, it means you've got to pay for the hosting of that separate instance of the LLM that you get to tune. And they're trying to figure out economic ways to do that. The alternative is going to be for fine-tuning a special model that perfectly set up for your particular use case, your company's data, isolated in your own server, with security and all that other stuff, is going to be fine-tuning an open source model. So you get an open source model, you put it together on a server architecture, and you tune it to do exactly what you want to do. That's a little bit down the line. Most of us are much happier working with the retrieval augmented method right at the moment. Fine tuning is for really advanced AI that's coming. That wasn't
so I would. My TLDR is to push back on Andy's TLDR. I don't necessarily.
We don't have two banners, man.
I don't agree that open source fine tuning is going to be a path that's going to be really utilized in the future. I think that once Google and Microsoft do their whole thing and get their whole co-pilots and everything working, everybody who's embedded in those ecosystems are going to utilize the ability to have their data already scrubbed and already trained, and everything, every solution that Copilot creates and outputs going to be already trained on your company's data. So you won't have to go through the effort of fine tuning. And furthermore, I think just like every other open source we talk about, the ones that tweak it are the nerds. And I use that term affectionately. The ones that do the actual going into these open source models and trying to train it and have it answer your questions for you specifically, and you put it on your phone and you have your own LLM on your phone. That's fun, but only the people that are really into that are going to be going that path. The companies, they're going to feel safer with the bigger models that have it embedded in the ecosystems. So I don't think it's going to be as common. So what's the TLDR? Just wait for the big dogs to come up with something, then you can use theirs.
My TLDR is I agree with Robert.
Woohoo! 2 days in a row.
I know.
Damn. Can I get a vote here? Man,
well, I'll go mine really quick. Mine's really easy, and that's that I just think that if this is a path you're thinking about in your business and thinking about going down or wanting to educate yourself more, stop right there. Go find somebody who's highly intelligent in this area. Pay them the $250 to $500 an hour, get on a phone call with them, and have somebody who's an expert in these areas who can clearly help you look at your use case and help you decide what the right path might be. But reading documents and going down, I mean, there's nothing wrong with educating yourself and wanting to be educated in space, and people need to do that. But at the same time, there's already people who are super, super intelligent out there. And if there's one thing I've learned from running businesses and all that is the faster you can not wear all the hats, the better off you're going to be. So go find the experts and go get the expertise from them. Save yourself a whole lot of grief and time.
Yeah.
Yep.
So mine is just going to be somewhat of a paraphrase of what I said before. I think that open source is going to benefit you whether you actively engage in it or not. One of the things that didn't come up on this show was the latest open source model, at least as of like 3 days ago or whatever it was Falcon, has 180 billion parameters in it. And it was released as open source. And I think open source is sort of pushing the edges and playing with that. So this is the largest. It's sort of in contrast to research that has started to say, actually, you don't have to go as big. You know, once the it's part of the reason that something that the people who come late can do it in shorter amounts of time, because the people who come first are like have a vision, but they have no idea if it's achievable, and they're so like doing all kinds of roads to it. And if you come after, you know it's achievable. You're finding the straightest line to the road and maybe some efficiencies. So I think that's beneficial to businesses as well. June me.
Yeah, I think what we're going to see, especially in the next 6 months, 12 months, is a massive push to make sure that open source or leaders in open source software and that philosophy get representation or their voice in policymaking. Right now, it's just all the large organizations like Google and Microsoft that are working with the government or the government is reaching out to for policy development. But open source needs to be part of that conversation. So I think there'll be a big push for that. And in the meantime, you'll see a massive scaling, as we've already seen, like hockey sticks for open source development. So I
But
think
who will be the representation, Jimmy? Like,
I'm sorry?
who will be the representative? Because open source is like thousands of people. Like, how would you?
Well, that is a barrier. That is a hurdle. Right now, I think the only organization that people as a whole in general know is Hugging Face. But I don't think they are going to be the only, representatives of that. So it would probably have to be a collective or a committee of some sort, which, committees slow things down as well. But that is a barrier that they'll have to get over. Exactly.
Yeah. All right.
Well,
on that note,
almost on time. We almost did it today, guys. Good for us. A great way to get that TLDR in a little bit earlier today, Jimmy. That was probably necessary. All right, guys. Hopefully you got something out of that. Really great conversations on everything as far as open AI. Tomorrow, we're going to be back talking about the CEO's AI guide, safeguarding tomorrow's business. So if you're a CXO, not just a CEO, so you're a CXO, and you're thinking about what do I need to know about AI? What's most important for me to understand today? And how am I going to safeguard my business for tomorrow? We'll be diving into all of that tomorrow. And of course, we'll be back the rest of this week. So with that, we will say goodbye, and we will see you guys tomorrow. Hope you guys got something out of that.
Arrivederci.
Happy Tuesday, everybody.
Bye.